I started feeling sick again, but I needed to find my son. I went to Lillian's house, entered without knocking, and saw my son sitting on the living room floor, playing with a toy truck with his friend and another child. I grabbed my son and told Lillian to never come near him again, or I would call the police. We went home, and I was very nervous and feeling unwell. At night, I noticed my son wasn't well. He was very withdrawn, and when I asked what was wrong, he said he had a stomachache that started after he drank what the woman gave him. Fearing it was poison or something similar, I rushed to the hospital and called my husband to meet us there. They ran all the tests and found nothing abnormal in his system. He only mentioned that the woman made him drink something bitter and foul-smelling. We were discharged after my son said he was feeling better. We returned home, and I had to hold my husband back from going to that woman's house. After that day, the real nightmare began. In the following days, my son woke up every night screaming that someone was sitting next to him on his bed. It got to the point where we had to have him sleep in our room to keep him calm. Every night, we prayed together for a peaceful night's sleep, and it worked for a while. One day, I felt something sit next to me on the bed, making the mattress sink. I woke up startled, shouting to my husband that someone was in our room, but there was nothing and no one. That same night, my son woke up thrashing in our bed. I tried everything to calm him down until he opened his eyes. His eyes were unnaturally red, and his voice wasn't his own. It was a deep voice, like a smoker's. It chilled my heart. With the teachings from my mother and late grandmother, I immediately knew this wasn't normal but something paranormal. Putting together the events of the previous weeks, it became clear that woman had done something to my son, something evil. Desperate, I called my mother and told her everything. She said she would call the priest to see what could be done. My son, or whatever he was at that moment, was lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling and mumbling incomprehensible words. He seemed possessed. Shortly after, my mother called back, saying she was coming over with the priest. They arrived a little later. My husband was so shocked he couldn't say a word. I explained to the priest that my son had been to a woman's house who seemed to be a Satanist, and that she had given him something to drink. The priest looked me in the eyes, took my hands, and said everything would be okay. We went up to the bedroom where my son was still lying, repeating the same words. We formed a circle around him and began to pray the Lord's Prayer with the Bible open in our hands. At the moment the priest started to expel whatever evil was in my son, that thing said clearly that it had come to destroy our family and had been summoned by someone out of jealousy. As this demonic voice described everything it planned to do, the priest continued the exorcism until the entity made its final threat: "I will still be here." Then, everything calmed down. I went to my son and broke down in tears. The priest mentioned that the entity was an evil being but weak, which made it easier to expel. Later, I explained what had happened as best as I could, and he said he would visit the school the next day because we were worried about the boy who frequented that house. The priest also suggested I go to the police, but I didn't. I don't know if the priest's visit to the school helped, but for the rest of the year, I noticed that the woman wore a wig, which made me suspect she was ill. We didn't exchange glances, much less talk, until one day, she and her son moved away. Everything was normal until a month later, when my son mentioned seeing something sitting on his bed again during the night. I informed the priest, but I don't know what else to do. I would appreciate any advice, as I don't know what that woman gave my son or what she did to him since he doesn't remember anything. Lately, I've noticed he's becoming very withdrawn again. Please help. It all started a year ago when I was taking my son to school. He was in the 2nd grade of elementary school. I always accompanied him to the classroom because he was still very afraid to go alone. Other mothers did the same, and that's how I met the mother of one of his classmates. Her name was Lillian, and she always had a captivating smile. From the first encounter, I noticed that Lillian was very tall, had dark hair, and brown eyes. We saw each other almost every day, and this eventually led to a friendship between us for a while. One day, she invited me to her house on a weekend and asked me to bring my son to play with hers. From the moment I arrived at her house, I felt a chill run through my body. Although I am very attached to religion, I don't attend church regularly. I pray and read the Bible every day. I confess that I had never had any contact with the supernatural and, at times, even doubted the existence of a higher being. However, I prefer to believe rather than doubt due to the teachings I received from my parents throughout my life. When I entered Lillian's house, I saw things that made me extremely uncomfortable. There were objects, toys, and decorations that clearly had a satanic connotation. This made me feel unwell. I started to feel dizzy and extremely sick. Quickly, I made up an excuse to leave. I know Lillian didn't believe my excuse, but even so, I grabbed my son and we left as quickly as possible. When we got home, the first thing I did was vomit and I felt really sick. I prepared dinner, but the feeling that my stomach was full and that something was stuck in my throat persisted. I mentioned to my husband that if this feeling didn't go away, I would need to go to the hospital. He said that if I still felt like that in the morning, he would take time off work to take me. I went to bed without telling him what I saw at Lillian's house. My husband stayed in the living room with our son while I was in the bedroom trying to control the nausea. Lying there, with everything spinning, I heard a noise like a chair being dragged. Scared, I sat up in bed and looked at the chair. Everything went black. In my dream, I was outside my body, observing the scene from above. Suddenly, my son's friend entered the room and took my hand. I kept asking what was happening, but he only pointed forward and pulled me. When he opened the door, what I saw was horrifying. A few meters away, I saw two children and a bonfire, surrounded by several people dressed in black. Two of these people approached the children and removed the bags covering their heads. It was my son and Lillian's son. I tried to run to them, but it was useless. I couldn't move or scream. Then, those two people set them on fire. I woke up gasping for air, crying a lot. I ran to the living room to see how my son was. He was next to his father, watching television. I picked him up and cried with relief. My husband, with wide eyes, asked what was happening. I went to the kitchen, got a piece of cake, and gave it to my son. Then I called my husband to the bedroom to talk. I told him everything as best as I could. He told me that he didn't want me to go to that woman's house anymore, and that our son shouldn't go there either. After that day, nothing unusual happened. Coincidentally, my son's classmates stopped showing up at school. I asked the teacher what had happened, and she said the family needed time for the boy's grandfather's funeral. I found it strange when, after 2 weeks, the boy still hadn't returned. I asked my son if he knew anything about his friend, and he said no, but he missed playing with him. A week later, I went to the doctor and got delayed picking up my son from school. When I arrived, I was surprised not to see him on the bench where he usually waited. I waited for a minute and then approached the first person I saw. I asked where my son was, and the woman, scared, told me that another student's mother had taken him, showing messages supposedly from me authorizing the pickup. I was already desperate and told her that I had never done that and never authorized anyone to pick up my son besides me.